Hello, everyone, and welcome to the continuation of my March of the Lich King card review. That is continuation because we started with the Death Knight review back when all of those were revealed, and that included not only the March of the Lich King cards, but all of the core set and Path of Arthas cards. But realistically, they're all new cards to us with the release of the new set, which is coming, if you somehow didn't know, on December 6th. So, with that in mind, and notably, we are continuing in alphabetical order because Death Knight, despite being the newest class, is the first in alphabetical order. So we're doing this just as we always do, and continuing with Demon Hunter. So let's get to it with, boom, Vengeful Walloper. 7 cost, 5/5 rush, costs 1 less for each Outcast card you played this game. There have been a few cards in recent sets that have kind of pushed an Outcast kind of theme deck. We haven't really seen any of that come to fruition. We've typically just seen the really efficient aggro style of Demon Hunter or the Relic style of Demon Hunter really be the directions that people go with this. This is, obviously if you have a significant number of quality and cheap Outcast cards in your deck, this can be a powerful board control tool, but a powerful board control tool is something that a lot of the Outcast cards already give you. So things like I-Beam or Chaos Leech or whatever. It doesn't really feel like the sort of thing that really pushes you in that direction to want to play an Outcast-focused deck. It's not really a major payoff. And also, kind of awkwardly, as an Outcast payoff, it's an awkward card to have in an Outcast deck because the payoff is mana reduction, and one of the major things that Outcast decks really want to make sure that they can do is play whatever card they have in their hand at any given time because they need to reorient things for Outcast. So having this Vengeful Walloper, say, sitting on the left-hand side of your hand can be really awkward. So, this feels like a weird card to me for those sort of combined reasons, right? It's not like a major payoff for the Outcast, like as far as an actual win condition is concerned, and it's also something that interferes with Outcast because it itself is difficult to cast without the right circumstances. So I don't really expect this card to really find very much play. Next up, speaking of Outcast cards, Wretched Exile. After you play an Outcast card, add a random Outcast card to your hand. Much like the other card we just saw, the Walloper. This is obviously an Outcast payoff card. This is more of a payoff card in my mind because it is actually giving you resources, which is something that can build you toward a way to actually win the game, rather than just being, hey, you're getting a somewhat undercosted rush minion, right? And if there are like enough really cheap Outcast cards you can kind of cycle through with these Outcast things with the Wretched Exile, that is, a pretty strong card in combination with Walloper. But again, I feel like the Walloper itself, because of the weird interaction it has with the Outcast card based on its own position in your hand, can be awkward. And this is also a little bit weird in that, like, okay, well, yes, you're getting paid off, you're getting more Outcast cards, but there's a really wide variety of the sort of things that the Outcast cards do. And, because you're playing an Outcast card and you're getting a new one, which is going to fundamentally be in the right-hand side of your hand, you'll have to be able to sort of chain all those together as Outcast cards, obviously, in order to really use this effectively. And, maybe this is the sort of thing that it's like, okay, well, this is a good payoff because you're playing a ton of super cheap stuff, right? Maybe you're just playing all of the cheapest Outcast cards with that. So this is your primary way of generating additional resources and, obviously reducing the cost of your Wallopers. But so, compared to the sort of more focused like Relic Demon Hunter or Aggro Demon Hunter, it feels difficult for this to really get off the ground in terms of not really having quite as much focus. All right, next. Another card clearly aimed at supporting that Outcast mechanic. Valerian the Forgotten. This is a legendary 4-cost 3/3 battle cry. Add a random Outcast card to the left and right sides of your hand. They cost 2 less. Obviously, another thing, hey, we're going to get that Walloper to work. We're going to get those Outcast things to work, things that really care about Outcast cards. Maybe with, all 3 of these and additional support, there's enough to really make an Outcast deck. But again, my concern is that the direction of all of the various Outcast effects is different, right? So you're kind of generating things that aren't necessarily going to push you down the same path, and the value you get from the previous card as well as this card and the theoretical tempo from the Walloper, all this kind of adds up into like this soupy, like, what am I actually trying to do here? As opposed to having a more focused plan, which typically is one of the things that you find in more powerful decks is, I have a game plan and I'm going to stick to it rather than, hey, I'm making a bunch of random stuff, as much as I might like that. Next up, Unleash Fel. I like the name, at least. 1 cost, deal 1 damage to all enemies. Mana Thirst 4 with Lifesteal. So, crucially, a Fel card. So, obviously works with Jace and that whole package. It is, a very powerful AoE effect against 1 health minions, or in particular, if you get spell damage, can be very, very strong with the Mana Thirst to clear off the board and gain you a bunch of life. This is, I think, in a world in which imp decks are popular, is a very good card there. And the the Mana Thirst can give you the ability to even get boost your health back up against the curses, which are popular at least currently in the sort of imp builds. So one of the things that Demon Hunter has historically had is not necessarily great ways for some of the decks to deal with wide boards, right? Like you can have big AoE stuff, or you can have Fel Barrage, but they didn't typically have great tools that they actually wanted to play that could help against things like imps. Obviously, like Keen Reflexes, but it's a bit awkward in most matchups. This is too, but it is at least a Fel card that again you can pair with Jace, and the additional upside of the life still can be a pretty big deal. It also, if you go to wild, maybe this works with Il'gynoth. Maybe you just go and nuke people to death with this there. But we're mostly focused on standard in this review, so I feel like this is kind of a hey, if you're looking specifically for great ways to help deal with swarm decks, which maybe there'll be more of them in the, with the Undead. Obviously, a bunch of reborn cards being added makes dealing 1 damage to the whole board stronger than otherwise be as well. Next up, we have Mark of Scorn. A 2-cost spell, draw a card. If it is not a minion, deal 3 damage to the lowest health enemy. So one of the archetypes that is going to be supported in this is minionless, sort of, Demon Hunter. So this is, just a cycle, blast something. It can be, killing a small minion. It can be just damaging your opponent because it is lowest health enemy. So feels like a reasonable sort of deck thinning cycling card that can have, meaningful impact on the board or just help burn your opponent's life total. So in that archetype, definitely, I think this is the sort of card that can be pretty powerful. Next up, Deal with the Devil. So obviously, again, if this is used in the no minion Demon Hunter deck, 3/3/3 lifesteal Fel Fiends. Pretty strong, right? Getting 9 power worth across 3 minions, and combine that with the ability to keep yourself afloat from a life total perspective. I think this is a pretty reasonable card, specifically, of course, for that archetype, because you are not really going to pay 5 for 2/3/3s, but 5 for 3, I think, starts to get interesting. It is, unfortunately, something that does die to most of the common AoE in the format, so it's possible that makes it not really worth actually playing. Depends on what the texture of the format looks like, but against sort of aggro / mid-range type decks that don't necessarily have things like Abyssal Wave or Nether Drake or whatever, can be a pretty powerful card. All right, this is a pretty interesting one. Brutal Annihilant, a 9/9 taunt rush. After this survives damage, deal that amount to the enemy hero. So this is a pretty powerful big demon. One of the things that we have not really seen have much success is the sort of big demon archetype for Demon Hunter. And part of that reason is that they just kind of don't have necessarily the right tools to actually survive to that point. There are some tools in this that might actually allow that, such as the Unleash Fel, perhaps. But this is also a way that you can actually end games. One of the sort of versions that I had seen floating around mostly kind of as a meme in the past has been like a Illidari Inquisitor deck that's looking to just make a bunch of copies of Illidari Inquisitor and then bring them back with all Fel breaks loose. There's another powerful card in that vein, in which it can blast your opponent's minions and get damage to their face and still protect you because it has both taunt and rush. So obviously pretty strong there. One of the big things that a lot of people were expecting to be powerful was when the Abyssal Depths got buffed to 3 costs to be able to Abyssal Depths into Vandar. And this is a very powerful tool in that kind of package. The question, of course, is more like, hey, how do you actually survive those early turns? How are you actually getting to the point in the game where you get to play this sort of thing? And I think that things like the Unleash Fel that I just mentioned before, and other sort of cheap removal, finding the balance there and actually having the big payoffs like this, that's obviously a lot more impactful than, say, playing Moarg Forge Fiend, which just gives you some armor, because this can actually close out the game itself. All right, and then we were discussing the Soul Eater's Scythe. This is the sort of cornerstone card of the no minion, quote unquote, no minion Demon Hunter. 4-cost weapon, start of game, consume 3 different minions in your deck, leave behind souls that discover them. So the way that this works is this is in your deck at the start of the game. 3 of your minions poof out of your deck, so they're no longer in your deck. So they can, you can still support the no minion cards, and this gives you cards in your deck that can then discover those minions. So it gives you additional access to specific copies of those minions. So if you're playing a deck that has, say, an individual power minion, like, I don't know, Jace, right? Jace is obviously a really cornerstone card in the decks that include him. You can play a deck that has Jace and has, say, 2 other minions, whatever they may be, and you're 3 times as likely to find Jace at a certain stage of the game, right? Because you get 3 cards in your deck that discover Jace. So, you have a lot more access to any individual one of those sort of key cards than you would otherwise. You could only discover an individual minion once, is my understanding. You can't get 3 Jaces over the course of the game with the souls that you get from your deck. But you still, can just ensure, well, I drew Jace on time again. It does remove the ability to do kind of fancy stuff like relic into a Jace or Bran or whatever to be able to actually, combo off like that. So there are definitely downsides. You also need to actually use the souls to discover them. But overall, I think this is a really interesting, really powerful card that can enable those sort of archetypes of, hey, which of these do you want? If say you have Jace, let's just say Jace, Mutinous, and Theotar as the 3 things, right? It's okay, I can choose whether I'm ready to try and play my win condition, or I want to get one of the cards that disrupt yours, right? So there's a lot of interesting tools in it that way. And also, your opponent can't Theotar or Mutinous or whatever your win condition until you actually, discover it and put it into your hand. So lots of interesting stuff that is possible with this, in addition to actually enabling all of the no minion cards that we are seeing in this set. Next up, we have Felori Warband. 4-cost. Deal 4 damage if your deck has no minions. Summon 4 1/1 Illidari with Rush. This is, kind of a new version of flanking maneuver that, kills a big thing, much like flanking maneuver, but gives you more flexibility. And this can actually just go face, too. It's just deal 4 damage, not deal 4 damage to a minion. So you can just, blast your opponent's face and have, some level of board presence with this. Or, obviously, use it as removal and kill, a single 8/8, much like you can with flanking maneuver, or kill one thing and sweep a board of small things. So, much like I was saying, in a metagame with stuff like the Imp decks, this can be excellent at not only killing a number of small things with sort of the back half, but also killing an individual large thing that got buffed by Vile Library, and having some bodies left over to clean up the Imps as well. So I think definitely a card, obviously only really good in a particular sort of deck, but I think as a strong option in the deck. And lastly, but not least by any means, Fierce Outsider. A 1-cost 2/1 rush. Outcast your next outcast card, costs 1 less. So this, I think, is kind of a workhorse tool for the outcast decks that we were discussing earlier. I still don't know that there's really enough to really support the archetype as something which is fundamentally powerful enough and focused enough to be a competitive deck. But this is a very, very good tool for those decks to enable multiple plays, to get additional cards off of the card that gives you a random outcast card, or to much more cheaply discount your walloper and get that down early as well. 1-cost 2/1 rush obviously is by itself not super powerful. There's a neutral one that you could easily play with, but obviously it itself being an outcast card and giving you the additional mana discount can be very valuable for the way that those decks seem like they're likely to want to play out. So anyway, that is Demon Hunter. Demon Hunter doesn't really feel like it has that many things that go toward existing decks outside of maybe Unleash Fel going into some of the Jace / Relic decks so far. It does feel like the no minion deck is the one that the new deck this is supporting that feels like it's the most compelling to me. I'm definitely going to experiment a bit with the Outcast decks as well, but they sort of, as I mentioned time and time again, feel like they don't necessarily have enough focus in order to really get the job done as sort of a major archetype. So no minion Demon Hunter as far as this class is what I'm looking at next. All right, next up we have Druid. Let's check it out. Number one, we have Underking, a 7-cost 6/6 with Rush, Battlecry, and Death Rattle, gain 6 armor. So there's a couple of themes for Druid in here. We have the armor theme, which is kind of a mini theme of this set. And then also Undead is obviously the new minion type that has a bit of a sub-theme in Druid. And then with Death Rattle is something that we have a bit of a theme in Druid from the previous set. So this is kind of a card that does a lot. Obviously, having a 12 armor from this card between the Battlecry and the Death Rattle is pretty powerful. It does cost 7. Druid obviously is quite capable of ramping up to heavier mana amounts. So I feel like this is like kind of just a solid role player type card potentially. I don't know if this is good enough to justify playing in the slot of over something like Scale of Onyxia, right? Scale of Onyxia is just kind of outrageous. And if what you're looking for is board control, it's hard to compete with that. You definitely need to be looking specifically at having Death Rattle synergies or armor synergies in order to justify playing this. And also, obviously, considering how important the bodies of Scale of Onyxia are for Infuse, specifically with Denathrius, you're kind of, gonna have to really have a lot of other ways to use the elements of this card compared to Scale in order to justify playing this. Obviously, it's not necessarily well you play this or you play Scale, because there are other options, and in particular, if you're playing a 40-card deck, you have more room for more stuff, but there's obviously a lot of competition and a lot of sort of necessary effects if you are looking at playing Ramp Druid. So, maybe this ends up being a tool that is specifically aimed at like just the armor or Death Rattle decks rather than seeing more generic use. Except we have Wither, 2-cost spell, nature spell. Choose a minion. Each friendly undead steals 1 attack and health from it. So as I mentioned, undead is a bit of a theme in Druid. This is kind of an interesting one because this is it's a removal spell of sorts, but it's only good if you have significant number of undead. This can be at best -7/-7 to an opposing minion and +1/+1 to your board. That's really powerful, right? That's actually super powerful, but it requires that you have a full board of undead. How likely is that? How many good undead are there in order to actually support? Specifically, most likely good cheap undead. Seems more difficult to have, a board full of big undead. Unlikely to be the way that you build your deck. But in those circumstances, even just like you have 3, right? -3/-3 to something +1/+1 to your board. That's pretty strong. Like in kind of a aggressive matchup. So we're not necessarily just looking at can you hit the absolute best case. The absolute best case is obviously super powerful. But how good is it in sort of the medium cases? And it seems like if you are playing a deck that can swarm the board with a bunch of cheap undead, that this is a powerful card in minion-based matchups. It is unfortunately not going to be good if your opponent doesn't have minions, which is pretty rare. But obviously, we were just discussing the no minion Demon Hunter, but even those tend to have at least some minions. So I feel like this is likely to be a powerful card if there is enough of a shell for a sort of aggro undead Druid deck, and there are definitely some other cards that support that direction. So let's take a look at this one, Nubian Flyer, a 2-cost 2/3 undead. If a friendly undead died after your last turn, summon a 2/2 Nerubian. So obviously, this is another card to sort of support that. It's a cheap undead. It's specifically having a battle cry to make a Nerubian. You can obviously the Nerubians themselves I don't believe are undead. I think, which is actually kind of important, but it is a Nubian Flyer. So I actually don't know if Nerubians are undead or not. My guess is that it would be, but Nerubians, they're like spider things, right? They're not necessarily undead. I guess that is an important element of how good this is, because how good like Wither is depends on oh hey, is this an undead that makes another undead? My guess is they probably are, because this, is itself an Nerubian, it's making a Nerubian, they're probably also undead. So I guess they're just undead spider bug things. Regardless, this is the sort of card that can lean very heavily toward making something like Wither actually be effective, and also just making your general buff cards in Druid be effective. Is this going to be better? Like, is the Undead shell worth it compared to, say, just traditional aggro Druid? I think that's also an open question, and we'll need to see what the sort of Undead look like and what the perks are on top of Wither, and on top of a card like this, in order to actually justify that. Like this, for instance, Eldernadrocks. 5 cost, 5/4, undead, battlecry, destroy a friendly undead, your minions gain its attack. So, yeah, that's powerful, right? We were talking about, hey, how good are the payoffs for that? Well, Wither is powerful, and this is also very powerful, right? Let's say you have, 4 minions, right? This, you play this, let's say 4 other minions. One of them is a 4/4. It's a Nerubian off of a Nerubian egg. I think we've concluded that those are going to be undead. So boom, okay, your minions get +4 attack. Like, that's a huge buff, right? The undead, like Wither, you can even Wither into this to buff. I guess Wither is just, it gives all your guys buffs, so it doesn't matter necessarily. But yeah, it's just a really big burst of damage. This can be much stronger than like a Savage Roar, all right, in terms of just how much damage you're actually doing. So yeah, I feel like this is obviously one of the really big payoffs. It is legendary. It's very Bloodlust-like, and that's obviously the sort of thing that the way that Druid decks play out, aggro Druid decks at least, they'd love to have. So huge payoff there for your undead aggro decks, and it's just sort of a matter of, okay, well, what do the creatures look like, right? How do I actually fill out my curve with undead? Because one of the things about undead, sort of typically, they tend to be minions with Reborn or minions with Death Rattles, so exactly the sort of thing that can be great for a Swarm style deck looking for sticky minions to be able to play something like this and actually end the game. So next up we have Anubra Khan. So this is obviously kind of the cornerstone of the armor theme for Druid. Legendary, 8 cost, 7/7. Battlecry, gain 8 armor. This turn your minions cost armor instead of mana. So the scariest thing about this to me is if you just are able to use, a bunch of things that give you armor, and like, oh, look, this just lets me, nuke someone with a Brand Denathrius combo without needing to have, a bunch of ramp or whatever. This card just seems very powerful. It's giving you essentially 8 mana when you play it. You're playing playing an 8 cost 7/7 allows you to play 8 mana more of stuff in addition to whatever else, right? Because it's giving you 8 armor itself. So obviously you need to have, other ways of gaining armor. Maybe the way this actually ends up functioning doesn't necessarily lead to it being in the same decks as, Brand Denathrius type stuff, because, well, they already have a ton of small, minion type things they want to get killed to infuse Denathrius. So maybe this isn't like about that kind of finisher, but it's a scary card, right? Because there are things like Brand Denathrius, or whatever, like this just turn into like Jailer, right? Pretty terrifying. Like I feel like this is definitely a really scary card that can generate really powerful board states, or ramp you up to finishers really quick. Anything that, like, any other card that gives you armor, obviously, like, just basically pays for itself. Like that Battlecry Death Rattle guy goes insanely well with this, because yeah, you play this, he's like, okay, well, I play that guy, he costs 7, he gave me 6 armor, so if I rush him in and get him killed, he effectively gains me mana to spend on minions this turn. Is this going to be just something that gets, sort of slotted into what we see as Ramp Druid now, or is there like another shell in addition to it? I am unclear as to what the answer to that question is. If it looks the Anubra Khan ramp versus the existing ramp, which actually, ends up working out better. Unclear, but definitely some powerful stuff to pay close attention to. Certainly, it is maybe overshadowed by like Guff right now, but this definitely enables, once Guff rotates, the ability to still have more than 10 mana turns, which, while it may not be necessarily important upon release of this set, will be important when the next set releases next year. All right, next up we have Unending Swarm, a 6 cost spell. Resurrects all friendly minions that cost 2 or less. So this is not really the sort of thing that goes into like aggro druid per se, because I think aggro would much rather just have more things that they replay and not necessarily, have a card like this glutted in their hand, but more like a mid-range undead. I would assume is kind of where I see this as wanting to be played. Say you're playing a deck that's using stuff like Wither and the 5-drop legendary, having the ability to refill your board with minions that cost for less, and in particular refill it with potentially things that have death rattles or reborn of their own, and just kind of grind your opponent down. It's fairly appropriate for a card called Unending Swarm, because you're just continuing to create swarms after swarms of minions, and looking for your things to buff them and to kind of end the game with them. So certainly a powerful card in games that go long and are grindy, but obviously as a 6-cost card, not the sort of thing that you're going to want in your opening hand, and maybe you don't want more than one of in your deck, just because it is certainly clunky to draw early and especially in multiples. It can be very powerful as well with Scale of Onyxia. If you just want like more copies of effective Scale of Onyxia, it doesn't seem like that's likely to be super common, because obviously it does nothing if you don't have your Scale of Onyxia yet. But it is interesting that it kind of gives you some redundancy in that effect if you want more copies of Scale, essentially in longer games, once you found your first. Next up, we have Chitinus Plating. 2-cost spell, gain 4 armor at the start of your next turn, gain 4 more. I don't know how, even if in a armor deck, this is necessarily that good. You need to have more ways that you care about getting your additional armor. Right now, it's just like Anubra Khan that spends your armor, that at least I have seen. Maybe I'm missing something. But this is quite a bit of armor, but I feel like you're going to likely want more attached to it in order to justify actually playing something that's just giving you armor. We've had options in the past like Feral Rage, things like that. And I feel like, things that have more flexibility are more likely to see play than just big bursts of armor, unless there's really, significant more payoffs. So speaking of sticky undead for the undead decks, this is a 1/1 undead with Death Rattle summon a 1/1 undead with Death Rattle summon an undead. So speaking of things that are going to be difficult for your opponent to kill, obviously with your swarm type stuff, this is going to stick around, very likely to give you the ability to trigger those things that if an undead died previous turn, yada yada yada, since your last turn. But just a super annoying zombie for your opponent to kill. It does give you sort of multiple possible options in your swarms. One interesting thing is that because this is a single minion that effectively gives you 3 different minions, if you are playing a deck with Unending Swarm, this fills out 3 of those spots, right? You don't necessarily have to have played 7 guys to get 7 guys back, right? Because you can play a zombie into something, which then gives you then something else, and it's like, okay, well, turn 6, I can make 7 minions with this because I have 7 unique minions that have died because of the death rattles to generate other minions. So it does feel like there is a good amount of sort of the undead swarm support available for Druid here. And so we have Beetlemancy. So obviously a flexible, choose one, gain 12 armor, or summon 2 3/3 beetles with taunt. We were talking about the 2-cost that is just effectively gain 8 armor. This is much less efficient, but does have the option of the taunts. And I sort of have to wonder again, how much we care about the actual armor from these as opposed to what you're actually getting from this effect. I don't think this feels like a particularly strong card unless you have major payoffs. And ta-da! Here's one. Crypt Keeper. So 8 costs 4/6 taunt, gains cost 1 less for each armor you have. So obviously playing things that are just giving you armor allow you to effectively play this for free. I don't know whether the 2-cost thing or the 5-cost thing are necessarily good enough, even with the Crypt Keeper here. If you're just, hey, I'm going to gain some armor, boom, get my taunt. Okay, well now you've spent like multiple cards effectively to get out a 4/6 taunt, which is good, in the early turns of the game, but not that relatively powerful once you get later. I sort of, I wonder where the sort of line is as to which of the armor cards, if you are playing, say with Anubra Khan and Crypt Keeper, are like good enough, right? Like, are you looking to just play, hey, I'm looking to have my armor gain and just looking to play board full of guys on turn 8 with Anubra Khan? So, maybe I'm playing like the 5-cost gain 12, but not the 2 cost gain 4 because that armor is likely to be, you know, burnt off by then. I think like the balance of where you actually want to find yourself is pretty interesting there, or whether it's just, you know, hey, I'm playing, you know, just the battle cry rush guy, Anubra Khan, and like, you know, hoping to just get the extra armor off of that by sending it into things. And just looking for Anubra Khan as a sole payoff. So, but yeah, I mean, this I think is a, you know, a fine card. As to whether it's like, you know, enough of a payoff to pull you away from the sort of token Denathorus build, or maybe it's something that finds its way into those, unclear. I feel like, you know, the sort of power level and kind of synergies of Druid that exist right now with the sort of token scale type versions is just very high. And, you know, I wonder how these sort of cards could potentially slot into this. Or, you know, if there's necessarily enough to really build a different, you know, like armor / ramp build, because a lot of these are also just like quite expensive. So you still want to use the ramp tools, it feels like. Actually, that raises a question in my mind that I did not answer. Okay, I was looking to see if Beetlemancy was a nature spell. It's not. So if Beetlemancy were a nature spell, or if Chitinus Plating, also not a nature spell. So they don't necessarily work with Widowbloom. You know, as being things you could draw, so you still want to have, you know, more of the other tools in the decks to actually ramp up and get your nature spells as well. So anyway, Druid kind of leaves me with a pretty big question mark. I do feel like the Wither and sort of Undead package, the Undead like sticky minion aggro package, looks to me to be something that I certainly want to explore, because not only just the undead in this set, but there's lots of other minions that I want to go check out and see, hey, you know, is this undead? Is this undead? Is this undead? You know, do I like look to build like a Nerubian egg Druid deck? And I think maybe the answer, you know, can just be yes, because of the power level of things like Wither and the legendary. But, you know, the armor package is one that I think is a bigger question mark to me, as far as like how it actually lines up compared to the existing ramp decks that we're seeing commonly right now.